The Absolute Universe of DC Comics has just launched, captivating the geek world. Not only because it presents us with very different versions than we are used to of iconic characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, but because it feels like the DC Comics version of what was once the Ultimate Universe of Marvel. That is, it was a friendly universe for new readers, which brings us different approaches and fresh new stories. Best of all, you can enjoy it without needing years of context from hundreds of comics. If you're confused about the Absolute Universe or curious about the concept behind it, this video is for you. As I'm going to tell you where the Absolute Universe comes from, what are the biggest differences with the central DC Universe, the approach it has, and I'll talk about the first titles to tell you if they're really worth it or not. Now, let's continue with the topic. Let's start by talking about what the Absolute Universe is. We must start by saying that this universe is part of the DC All-In initiative. It serves as a fresh entry point into the DC universe for new readers. In the company's words, DC All-In provides a fresh entry point without the need for reboots or retcons. So each of the All-In titles were written in such a way that they start new stories and narrative arcs so that everyone can start reading these stories easily. Soft reboots are common in companies like DC Comics, seen in events such as Rebirth, Dawn of DC, and DC Universe. Something that has drawn a lot of attention from this universe is that it feels very similar to what was once the early century Ultimate Marvel universe, which was very successful initially as it attracted many new readers. Cause it felt like a great opportunity to start reading comics. In fact, it feels like this, as according to a Popverse report, Absolute Batman in a few weeks has become the best-selling comic of 2024 with around 400,000 copies sold, even surpassing Ultimate Spider-Man. So, the Absolute Universe so far is working very well. Remember, as mentioned, it's part of the DC All-In initiative but has differences from other sub-reboots. The main one is that this arc will be overseen by Scott Snyder, who gained great recognition for his classic Batman run and will present two different narratives within the story. The first is the central universe we all know, one that focuses on classic characters and values like hope, which Superman radiates to the entire universe. And a second narrative that is the Absolute Universe, which derives from Darkseid's energy. So here the heroes will be born facing greater problems, they will have fewer advantages, and will be forced to live in more adverse circumstances. This becomes much clearer upon reading DC All-In Special Number 1. One thing I really enjoyed about this comic is its flipbook presentation. Half of the comic talks about the formation of the new Justice League from the perspective of hope, heroism, and Superman. And then, by flipping the comic over, you can read the story from Darkseid's perspective. Both stories end with the same image, which makes sense no matter which side of the comic you start the story from. So this issue uses the physical format of the comic to add more weight to the narrative, something I love when it happens. Let's see now what this one-shot proposes because it is the basis of the entire Absolute Universe. In the section focused on hope, titled Alpha, we see how a new Justice League and a new headquarters begin to form using the knowledge and technology of several of its members. This new league would not have a small number of members, but the idea is to unify all the heroes under one large team called the Unlimited Justice League. A piece that I really enjoyed reading from this comic was when Superman personally went with Booster Gold to deliver his league badge and told him that he had earned it, which is sweet, but then you also start to think that they basically invited everyone. So it would have been bad if they didn't invite Booster as well. This section ends with Darkseid merged with the Spectre, arriving at the League's headquarters and attacking all the heroes because he is seeking a certain truth, certain knowledge that he seems to ignore. At the end of the confrontation, Darkseid apparently dies, but not before thanking the League and leaving a tear in spacetime, which leads to a previously unknown universe, which Mr. Terrific calls the Alpha Universe, which is what we in the real world know as the Absolute Universe. According to Mr. Terrific himself, this Alpha Universe is particularly dangerous because it vibrates chaotically, so it can only be visited by people who have an abundance of tachyon particles. Booster Gold, a time traveler, had a role in this story. This section of the comic ends with Booster Gold traveling to the Alpha Universe and finding himself in a world that is apparently under the dominion of Darkseid, who now has an evil version of the Legion of Superheroes as his army. If you notice, the focus of this section is very much linked to the classic focus of superheroes because we have several emotional sections where the superheroes work together to achieve a better tomorrow, the hope of a new Justice League, and good triumphing over absolute evil after the battle against Darkseid. But another thing that I found very interesting is that this first section, Alpha, poses the questions and then the Omega section, the answers. At the beginning of this section, we see how Darkseid is alone in Apocalypse, obsessed with knowing where an immense power he just received comes from, so he forces the great designer Hemon to create a miracle machine which would allow him to make a single wish. When the machine is complete, Darkseid gives his own blood, first through his hand and then through his son, to be able to link with it, and embarks on a journey to find the missing ingredient, a person, someone who will help him to be more than he is. Darkseid then fights against the forces of hell, against the army of heaven, against the Quintessence, which are some of the most powerful beings in the DC universe, and against Eclipso himself, to be able to find Jim Corrigan, the person who once was the host of the Spectre and wishes to merge with him. After this, he immediately travels to Earth to face off against the new Justice League. This is where the answers begin. Thus was born the DC Absolute Universe. Darkseid has merged with the Spectre and confronts the Justice League asking for answers, as he does not understand his true role in the universe. And it is the Spectre himself who answers him. He tells him that the central universe of 100 is one that has life as its central force, a force that expands and multiplies despite adversities. It is hope, and the being that represents this energy is Superman, which takes up an element from the Doomsday 100 Lock comic, which tells us that the reality of the 100 universe is directly linked to Superman. Darkseid, on the other hand, is the opposing force, an essential and unique force in the entire multiverse, so there is only one. That's why Darkseid is. However, the God of Evil is not satisfied with this and decides to lose his life to Superman so that his own vital energy radiates to a universe called Alpha. Thus was born the universe that we readers call Absolute, one that would not have life and hope as the central element, but the challenge. A world where heroes would be born facing greater adversities, where they would not be raised in paradise, but in hell. A world where they are the chaos and not the system, and where they will have to shine brighter than ever in order to survive. Because this world derives directly from Darkseid's energy. I enjoy the story of two universes that derive energy from different characters. It feels like complementary stories. The Absolute Universe derives from the DC Universe, but they propose different narratives and approaches, and that is justified in the story. You can also enjoy them individually. But well, what are these stories about? In Absolute Batman, Bruce Wayne is the son of a teacher and social worker, not a millionaire. He loses his father in a zoo shooting. This caused Bruce Wayne, who was considered a genius from childhood, to grow up with social resentment and making bad decisions until he eventually straightened his path and began to forge Batman by studying different combat techniques, but also subjects such as applied mechanics, chemistry, and criminal psychology, all to eventually become a vigilante. If you look closely, it has much in common with the familiar Batman. He's a brilliant strategist and fighter who values human life, but he buys his bat gear in small installments. That's not the only big difference, but this Batman developed as a child a technology inspired by bat wings that allow him to create portable structures like bridges, something he incorporates into his cape and uses to fight crime. This concept of the cape as a structure is used by Batman, as he's also a character who builds bridges, metaphorically speaking. As writer Scott Snyder said, this Batman, despite looking extremely tough and imposing at 2 meters tall, is someone who, instead of scaring the bad guys and sending them back into the shadows, is trying to bring the good people into the light and tell them, we can handle this. He is a unifier. Another interesting detail is that Alfred Pennyworth is introduced as a military-trained agent who initially tries to capture Batman, but gradually their paths align. The second title, Absolute Wonder Woman, features Diana as the Princess of Hell raised by sorceress Circe, traveling in a Pegasus corpse instead of an invisible plane. Who wrote this? Zack Snyder? This comic tells us that Diana is the last of the Amazons who for some reason are in conflict with Zeus, so he took Diana away as punishment for their crimes against the gods and sentenced her to grow up in hell. However, Circe grows fond of her over time, teaches her magic and readies her for adulthood. Something very interesting about this comic is that it takes very strong elements from mythology, like this panel where Diana, as a baby, defeats the snakes that come for her, just as it happened in the myth of Hercules or Heracles, to be more precise. Fun fact, if you watch the Disney Hercules movie, there's also a mythological reference to this through Pain and Panic, who at one point in the story transform into snakes and try to bite Hercules. Finally, there's Absolute Superman. In Absolute Superman, we see a mix of classic and new elements of Superman. Let's start with what has already been seen. Here they tell us that Krypton is destroyed due to greed that ends up consuming the planet's natural resources, and that there is a strong cultural taboo with exploring space. Two themes that we had already seen in Man of Steel, but here they are more developed. as they tell us that the elite of Krypton has a system that benefits the rich who charge workers for things like rain, and that talking about exploring space can cost you your job, just as it happened to Lara Cal's mother. But the story also has new elements. Lara and her husband Yorel are part of the working class known as the Steel People. They wear their emblem on their chest and face discrimination from the Kryptonian elite due to their lower social status. That's why this Superman fights in our world to eradicate the injustices that big companies commit against workers, just like these miners we see in issue number 1, which tells us that we have a story with a strong social criticism, but well, really that's how the best Superman stories are. Another key difference is this Superman has an AI that assists him and must recharge his solar power periodically. Superheroes have fallen from grace in the DC universe. Here Batman is no longer a millionaire but a young man who has to work to survive. Diana is now the Princess of Hell, no longer of Themyscira. And Superman no longer comes from the elite of Krypton, but his parents belong to the marginalized working class. This occurs for two reasons, one shown in the comic and the other related to our world. The reason given in the comics is because the absolute universe derives from the energy of Darkseid, who radiates this universe to make it more chaotic, disordered, and challenging for the heroes who will have to shine even stronger to survive. The reason outside of the comics was mentioned in an interview by writer Scott Snyder, who said that sometimes he felt that Bruce Wayne punched more downwards than upwards, as it's hard not to punch downwards when you come from a family of millionaires. This relates to our current times. In the 30s and 40s, when many of these characters were born, they were written as millionaires and princesses because they were positions that people admired. However, over the years we have increasingly questioned millionaires, asking for example where their fortune comes from or whether it is ethical for them to have so much money. The same goes for royal figures, so it makes sense that comics adopt this narrative, trying to make these characters more relatable to the general public. And one could be ideologically for or against this. That's a separate issue, but we can't deny that superheroes have always behaved this way. All these elements have made the Absolute Universe feel like a whole event. Something people don't want to miss. DC is set to release absolute versions of characters like Flash, Green Lantern, and Martian Manhunter, signaling the start of a new editorial direction. Which tells us that this is a great time to start reading and fully immerse ourselves in this universe. Let me know in the comments if you've read these comics and your thoughts, as I'd love to hear them. For more comic book videos, check out the ones linked here, including one specifically about the Ultimate Universe. That's all for today. I'm Gu, and keep looking beyond the obvious.